Okay, in this lecture, we're going to be looking at our another argument for the existence of God and assessing it critically. And this argument is called the Ontological Argument. And I hope by this point you know what the word ontology means. But I think it'll be perhaps evident why it's called the Ontological Argument once we get to the actual premises and the reasoning behind it. So this argument, we're going to be looking at Descartes' version of it first. Descartes was a 17th century French philosopher. But he kind of stole the argument from this medieval philosopher named Anselm. So we'll be spending a good chunk, the majority of time, actually looking at Anselm's version of the ontological argument. All right, well, let's just jump right into it. But actually, let me take a step back, though. This argument, in my opinion, is not as technical as for example, the contingency argument. But it does take some time to kind of motivate it, though. So I'm not going to bombard you with nearly as many technical concepts as I did with the contingency argument, but we're going to spend some time developing this. So just as we did with the contingency argument, this will be a two-part lecture. Okay, just so you can kind of take the time to absorb the material and think it through. I also note that this will be a controversial argument. It has always been controversial. It is still controversial to this day. Every good philosophical argument is incredibly controversial. And when I say good, I don't mean that the argument has true premises. I just mean that it's not necessarily easy to find out what's false with the premises of the argument. So well, let's just jump right into it then. Actually, let me say one more thing, though. This argument's been around for about 1,000 years. And there is different versions of it are still defended to this day. There's a living philosopher named Alvin Plantinga who actually just retired after teaching at Notre Dame for a long, long time. He was just, out in South Bend, a couple hours away from us, in the northern part of Indiana. Well, he wrote a book defending a new version of this ontological argument, I believe in the 70s or the 80s, that generated a lot of discussion from theists and atheists and agnostics. Obviously, he didn't persuade a lot of people, but a lot of people felt like the argument was impressive enough that it was worth responding to, at least. Because what Alvin Plantinga did was he took a bunch of notions that these philosophers kind of were assuming and were utilizing. A lot of the notions dealing with possible worlds and modality, stuff that we looked at in the lecture on the contingency argument. And then from there he argues that God exists in every possible world by the concept of it. But we're going to look at the older, traditional version of the argument today. So let's just jump right into it. So before we begin, and before I even present the ontological argument, I should first note, though, that there's a very important contrast between the ontological argument and the cosmological and contingency arguments. The causal argument and the contingency arguments. Mainly, ontological arguments attempt to establish the truth of their conclusion a priori. That is, they'll try to establish the conclusion, mainly that God exists, through reflection on concepts. They're not going to appeal to any empirical premises that rely on observational data, for example. And this is unlike the contingency argument or the causal argument. So, ontological arguments, then, the reasoning by which we reach a conclusion is a lot like the reasoning by which we do mathematical proofs, like for here. So again, I've said this before, mathematics, in principle, doesn't rely upon empirical observations. Yeah, mathematicians use pens and papers and calculators to aid them in their thinking, but they don't need that. It's possible, in principle, to do all these mathematical proofs without observations. This is unlike sciences such as biology, physics, chemistry, where you need observational data, where a lot of the work done in developing these theories is in the laboratory, for example, or looking around the world, sniffing, smelling, tasting, and so on. So this is a crucial difference between the ontological argument, then, and the other arguments that we've looked at in this unit. Well, the primary notion behind all ontological arguments is the view that we cannot properly apprehend the concept of God without acknowledging that it entails God's existence. So there's something about the concept of God such that once you understand it, you have to understand that it means that God exists. We'll get to that more precisely what we mean by that soon. So this will require a little bit of conceptual analysis, but not nearly as much as you would think. But just enough to show that, just enough to motivate, at least initially, The defender of the ontological arguments claim that just mere reflection on the concept of God is all you need to know that God exists. So that's a peculiar concept, by the way. Well, our understanding of God is of a being of a very special sort. Duh. God, even if you're an atheist, you'd have to admit that if God existed, God would be a very unique, special kind of being. There's something special about God that, say, you and me and horses and pebbles and rocks and bowls of Cheerios don't have in common. Well, what is this thing that makes God so special? Well, it's this, that God is maximally perfect. And I don't just mean morally perfect. Perfection, so oftentimes when you hear the word perfect, you know, and your mom says, nobody's perfect, she doesn't just mean morally perfect, like you've never told a lie before. Think about in sports, the perfect baseball swing. Or think about, you know, someone who's a carpenter who makes a chair, and you'd say, oh wow, that guy made just the perfect chair. Or think about a paper you write that you get an A+. The professor finds no mistakes with it. You wrote a perfect paper. So perfect doesn't just mean moral, but it is an evaluative term. Philosophers say it's an evaluative claim. So when you say that something is perfect, you're evaluating that thing in some sense. So evaluative claims, we make them all the time. That was a good movie. This band makes great music. This painting sucks. Davis told a funny joke. Funny is an evaluative term. It's kind of, it means that we're evaluating it. We're establishing some worth to it, I guess. We're making a value judgment. So this is what we mean by perfection, and it's a much broader term than morally perfect. We mean that God is maximally perfect. Okay, this goes back to then what makes God so special? That's a funny question to ask. What makes God special? We'd say that God is a very special type of being because God is maximally perfect. God is greater than any other being could possibly be. So ontological arguments are going to start with this understanding of God, this concept of God, and then, you know, go on from there. So they're going to purport to show that God's existence deductively follows from this above concept. Mainly that God's existence deductively follows from the fact that God is maximally perfect. Alright? So even the atheist would say, without believing in God, yeah, if God existed, God would be maximally perfect. I just don't believe God exists. Well, what they're going to try to show is if the concept of God is such that God is maximally perfect, God has to exist. That's how the argument will go, in a nutshell. So we need to get clear then on what a concept is, as the ontological argument is going to purport to prove God's existence from God's concept. So this leads to two very different ways of considering concepts. First, there's a sense in which concepts are mental entities, mental thingies in the mind, okay? So for example, take Tim and Bob's different individual concepts of dogs, which are vastly different. So Tim's concept of a dog is such that dogs are these good, loyal pets. I guess his dog is Lassie. Alright? I don't know if any of you remember that show. Alright, well, Bob's concept is that dogs are ferocious, leg-humping carnivores. So, Tim and Bob have very different concepts of dogs, and we mean concept in this first sense of a kind of individual, subjective, private, mental thingy. Alright? But there's this other sense in which it is correct to say that there's only one concept of a dog. And this would be the core concept which Tim and Bob share, and to which they have added their idiosyncrasies. So, for example, this would be the concept is, this would be a dog is any animal belonging to the family Canidia. This is the concept that they share. It's not private and subjective. They're, and that's what we're generally we'll be talking about when we say that, you know, Tim and Bob are talking about the same thing. They just have different opinions of the same thing. So this is the view of concepts, and then that we're going to be dealing with in the ontological argument. This second view, which is not subjective, it's objective. It's not private. It's kind of this publicly accessible thing. However minds access concepts. This is what we'll be describing. And how, by the way, the question of how minds access concepts is another kind of interesting, fun philosophical puzzle. But it's the type of thing that, like, we all do it. This goes back to that lecture I did on sentences and propositions. we know that when someone in German says es regnet and someone in English says it's raining, we know they mean and are saying the same thing. So the meaning is different from the sentence. Well, the meaning then is this kind of second sense of the concept. All right, so on the second view, a concept is not a private subjective mental entity. Instead, a concept is a single objective and perhaps abstract entity that we can all understand and share. All right? Oh. So concepts then are like numbers and they're like propositions. There's a single proposition that each of us understands when we understand that all humans are mortal. And there's a single number we're considering when discussing among ourselves whether 37 is prime. Even though we might, you might be thinking about that in German and I'm thinking about it in English, we're still thinking about the same number 37. Okay? Well, like I said, we're going to be concerned with the second view here. So understood in this way, concepts will serve as objective criteria for picking out things of a certain specific kind or discriminating it from other kinds of things. So, for example, the concept of a dog distinguishes it from other objects in the world. All dogs fulfill the criteria of being an animal in the family Canidia, but nothing but a dog could satisfy these conditions. So concepts in this second sense are a lot like, if not the same thing as, philosophical definitions, like the ones we looked at when we were on the unit on conceptual analysis. They pick out all and only X. So the concept of a square is true of all squares and only squares. The concept of a dog is true of all dogs and only dogs. This is the concept that we're going to be addressing when we're looking at the concept of God, something that is true of only God and anything that is God. But nothing that is not God satisfies this concept. All right. Okay. So we'll call these necessary and sufficient conditions. Hey, that's familiar. Necessary because an object must satisfy them to be a dog. Sufficient because satisfying these conditions is enough to qualify the object as a dog. Well, recall, a few slides ago we noted how extraordinary the suggestion is that by simply reflecting on the concept of a thing, one might derive the existence of that thing. This may strike some of us as implausible. So again, the suggestion is this. You can just merely reflecting upon the concept of a thing, you can derive the existence of the thing. Thinking about the concept is all it takes to know that the thing that the concept of exists. All right? Does that strike you as implausible? Well, yeah, I mean, it probably does. So, for example, even if we have the concept of a dog, we're not guaranteed that there are dogs in the world. It's possible that dogs fail to exist, and yet still we could have the concept of a dog. So, for example, here would be an example. Suppose all dogs died of rabies tomorrow, which would be incredibly tragic. It is possible. Well, then in the future, in 100 years from now, people could know what it would be for something to be a dog, even though there, in fact, are no dogs. All right? So, yeah, it seems a bit, implausible to say that reflection on a concept is all it takes to know that whether or not something exists. Similarly, I had the concept of a river flowing with molten gold or of Santa Claus, but just mere reflection on that isn't enough to know that there actually are rivers of molten gold or that there is a Santa Claus. All right? So prima facie, that's Latin for at first glance, the existence of a thing cannot be determined a priori by reflection on concepts. Instead, as the existence of dogs, rivers of gold, or Santa Claus are discovered empirically, the answer to the question must be found a posteriori. Yeah, a posteriori means through observation, through experience, okay? So we can't know whether or not there's a Santa Claus unless we verify it. We can't know whether or not there are dogs unless we verify it. We can't know whether or not there are rivers of gold without observations. But think about the opposite conclusion, though. Sometimes we can think about a concept, and then by thinking about a concept, we can infer the non-existence of something that would satisfy that concept. Really? What kinds of things are that? Well, take the case of a round square. The necessary and sufficient conditions for being a round square are that the object or figure be both round and square. But this includes contradictory criteria. We know that nothing could exist that satisfies both those conditions, that it be round and square, because nothing can be round and not round at the same time. But to be square is to be not round. So we can be sure that there are no round squares. So by thinking about the concepts of some things, we can infer their non-existence. And again, I'll say it again. So in the case of concepts that have contradictory criteria, we can infer their non-existence. Second, consider the case of you. Yes, you. Perhaps you can know a priori that you exist. That is, without using your 5 senses, you can know you exist. You don't need observations. You don't need to smell something to know that you exist. Instead, knowledge of your existence only requires recognition of the fact that you're currently thinking. But that doesn't require any empirical investigation. So you can know at least one thing exists without observation, you. You can know also that things don't exist by reflecting the concept if the concept has contradictory criteria, like round squares. Then here's another simple claim. You don't need to discover empirically or a posteriori that there is an odd number smaller than 3. And just to preempt, if I was in the physical classroom, there'd always be some smart student in the back. Did I say smart? I meant smart ass student that says, there's no odd number smaller. You can't know that. And I'd say, shut up. Yeah, you can. All right. So basically, we can know that we know numbers exist without observations. That's what I'm getting at. So given these 3 reasons, then, we shouldn't let the objection that existence can't be discovered by a priori means deter us from moving ahead. Well, let's move ahead then. Okay, let's take a look at the concept of God. There have been 3 traditional properties that philosophers have ascribed to God, and these would be omnipotence, omniscience, and moral perfection. Omnipotence means all-powerful, omniscience means all-knowing, and then moral perfection. And we just had a discussion about perfection earlier in this lecture. Well, in addition to these properties, Descartes and Anselm argue that if God has the three traditional properties of omnipotence, omniscience, and moral perfection, then God must have all perfections. For according to Descartes and Anselm, as well as many other theistic philosophers, God is the greatest, most perfect being possible. As such, he will have all perfections. So in the remainder of this unit, then, we're going to refer to properties like omnipotence, etc. as perfections, properties that the most perfect of all beings would have, okay? Just as an aside. Well, as we shall see, what motivates ontological arguments is the view that another property is required to make a thing perfect, a property that a being must have, if indeed it is to be the greatest, most perfect being possible. Well, let's take a look at Descartes' argument then. Descartes writes, "Certainly the idea of God, or a supremely perfect being, is one which I find within me, just as surely as the idea of any shape or number. In my understanding that it belongs to his nature that he always exists, is no less clear and distinct than is the case when I prove of any shape or number that some property belongs to its nature. It is quite evident that existence can no more be separated from the essence of God than the fact that its 3 angles equal to 2 right angles can be separated from the essence of a triangle, or that the idea of a mountain can be separated from the idea of a valley. Hence, it is just as much of a contradiction to think of God, that is, a supremely perfect being lacking existence, that is, lacking imperfection, as it is to think of a mountain without a valley." That's from Descartes' 5th meditation. Well, here's his main idea. If anything is God, it's got to be perfect. Everyone agrees on that point. Well, the perfections we normally regard as necessary for a thing's being God would include omniscience, omnipotence, and moral perfection. But existence, according to Descartes, is also a perfection. It's a perfect-making property. Well, it follows then that God must have the property of existence. Well, to say that God has the property of existence is just to say that God exists. So God exists. Here's the argument a bit more formalized. Premise 1. God is understood as a being with all perfections. Premise 2. Existence is a perfection. Premise 3. So God has the property of existence. 4. So God exists. Alright. Well, the argument's valid, so the question is, what premise would you challenge to be, or repulsed by the conclusion? Well, we're going to look at that throughout this lecture. I note something, though, about the first premise. Even an atheist can have a concept of God, even though the atheist denies that God exists. Just like we have the concept of Santa Claus, even though we probably deny that Santa Claus exists. So then to deny that God exists, you have to actually understand the concept of expressed by God. You can't deny the existence of something without having an understanding of what the concept is of the thing you're denying the existence of. Right? I can't, if I deny that Vulcans exist, I should actually know what I'm talking about. Alright? So once one understands this concept, as properly including the notion of supreme perfection, Descartes argues that, well, we can't withhold the property of actual existence to God. Aha! Gotcha! Haha! So in this sense, our concept of God is special and unlike our concept of a triangle, which can exist but doesn't have to, or of a square, a circle, which cannot exist. Descartes writes, possible existence is a perfection in the idea of a triangle, just as necessary existence is a perfection in the idea of God. For this fact makes the idea of a triangle superior to the idea of chimeras, which cannot possibly be supposed to have existence. Well, Descartes' version of the ontological argument is what philosophers call a direct argument. The conclusion follows directly from the premises without any additional assumptions. In the next part of this lecture, in the next video, we're going to take a look at Anselm's version, which is what philosophers call an indirect argument, or a reductio ad absurdum, a reduction to the absurdity, which we'll look at soon.